There are men who wrote history in ink, and there are men who wrote it in pain. In the mid-18th century, across the warm blue waters of the Caribbean, an Englishman stepped onto the docks of Jamaica. His name was Thomas Thistlewood, a man of letters, a man of empire, a man who kept a diary for more than 3 decades. 30 years of daily entries. 30 years of plantations, punishments, and power. 30 years that would reveal the inner workings of a world built on bondage. A world so cruel that even those who lived inside it sometimes refused to look. Thistlewood's words survived. They were never meant to be read by us. But today we open that diary, and what spills out is not just one man's story, but a mirror held up to the entire machinery of slavery. This is the story of Thomas Thistlewood, the overseer who came to paradise. A paradise, they said, of sugar and wealth. But for the people who worked its soil, Jamaica was a furnace. And in that furnace, Thomas Thistlewood found his calling and lost his soul. The year is 1750. England is rising. The Industrial Revolution is stirring, and sugar is the currency of empire. From London's parlours to Liverpool's docks, fortunes are made not by the men who toil, but by the men who trade in flesh. One of those men, hungry for opportunity, sets sail for Jamaica. Thomas Thistlewood is 30 years old, educated in Lincolnshire, a quiet scholar by reputation, well-read, precise, ambitious, and poor. He sails not as a missionary or an explorer, but as an overseer, a supervisor of enslaved labor on a British plantation. His task is to extract profit from human lives. When he arrives in Savannah-la-Marque, the air is heavy, sweet, and foreign. The sun presses down on fields of cane that shimmer like mirrors, and the sound that stays with him is not the sea or the birds but the rustle of chains, the calls of workers under command, and the constant, rhythmic crack of the overseer's whip. In this world, brutality is not hidden, it is systematized. It's written into ledgers, counted in barrels, and justified by sermons. Cruelty is not a crime here. It's a profession. Thistlewood, newly arrived and eager to rise, begins to learn that profession from the men around him, men who call themselves gentlemen but live as gods of punishment. To understand Thistlewood's Jamaica, you must understand its logic. By 1750, the island was Britain's richest colony, exporting thousands of tons of sugar and rum each year. But that wealth was built on the lives of the enslaved, African men and women torn from their homelands, forced into endless labor. The ratio was staggering. For every white man, there were 10 Africans enslaved. The fear of rebellion was constant, and so violence became the language of control. Punishment wasn't just retribution, it was a message delivered through flesh and fear. Overseers like Thistlewood were expected to keep order by any means necessary. He watched, he learned, and soon he began to record. Every lash, every punishment, every act of discipline, written down with the precision of an accountant. But these were not the writings of conscience. They were the writings of habit. Thistlewood's diary was not a confession. It was a logbook of domination. On his first plantation posting, called Egypt, Thistlewood began to keep a record. Each day he noted the weather, the crop yields, the names of enslaved workers, and the punishments meted out. At first, it reads like the diary of an orderly man, but then as weeks turn to months, the pattern changes. His entries begin to merge labor with cruelty. Each person is reduced to a line, a number, an object. He writes of punishments with cold detachment, as if describing chores or inventory. He measures obedience in welts and compliance in silence. Every word carries the weight of a world where humanity is stripped to bone and record. Thistlewood did not invent cruelty. He inherited it. The plantation system trained men to believe that pain was efficiency, that breaking a spirit was the same as building order. And he obeyed that system completely. Among the enslaved was a woman named Phoeba. She would become one of the few recurring names in his diary, a woman who lived with him for decades. To Thistlewood, she was a possession, a servant, and yet, in the twisted world of the plantation, also a partner. Their relationship, recorded in cold lines, shows the impossible contradictions of slavery. Intimacy built on coercion, affection built on power. Through Phoeba's presence, we see how deeply the institution poisoned even the idea of love. For Thistlewood, she became a constant. His cook, his caretaker, his companion. But never, in his mind, his equal. Every act of kindness he recorded toward her sits beside acts of cruelty toward others. The same hand that wrote her name with care also documented punishments without remorse. The diary becomes a portrait of moral decay, a man who sees himself as civilized, while living in a world of sanctioned barbarity. The overseer's world was a factory of pain, a system so complete that even the cruel believed they were merely doing their duty. Each plantation had its rules, its hierarchies, its rituals of control. Thistlewood enforced them all and wrote them all down. He punished disobedience, rewarded compliance, and measured worth in labor. As the years passed, he grew accustomed to it, even proud. The most terrifying thing about Thomas Thistlewood is not the violence he inflicted, but how normal it became to him. How cruelty turned from exception to expectation. How a man with a diary could commit daily horrors and still end each entry with, "Weather fair. Good night." That was the plantation system's true victory. It didn't just enslave bodies. It enslaved conscience. By the end of his first year in Jamaica, Thomas Thistlewood had become what the system wanted him to be: efficient, loyal, and brutal. He earned respect from fellow overseers, fear from the enslaved, and satisfaction from his employers. And with each page of his diary, he left a record of how empire sustains itself, not by greatness, but by cruelty repeated until it feels like order. But this is only the beginning. In the next chapter of his life, Thistlewood would descend even deeper into the routines of control, the calculations of punishment, and the cold arithmetic of power. Because what he wrote was not only the story of one man's evil, it was the story of a system that turned men into monsters and called it civilization. Thistlewood had been on the island only a short while when the rhythms of plantation life began to shape his days. The sun rose over the cane fields in waves of gold, but to the men and women forced to work them, it was not a sunrise, it was a summons. The overseer's horn would sound, and hundreds would gather in the dark before dawn, lined up by name, bodies weary from the day before. For Thistlewood, this was the new order of his life: measured, repetitive, relentless. He rose early, wrote his notes, and then set out across the fields on horseback, his journal folded neatly into his coat. The plantation itself was a living machine, every part moving toward a single goal: sugar. The fields, the boiling house, the curing room, the wagons to the port, each piece depended on the invisible, brutal energy of those enslaved within it. In England, men toasted prosperity with rum. In Jamaica, men like Thistlewood made that prosperity possible through a world organized around exhaustion. Thistlewood came to understand this system not as an outsider but as its instrument. His early entries record his fascination with how order was maintained, how the overseers kept books on every worker, how quotas were tracked, how even punishment had a timetable. He learned that cruelty was not chaos, it was method. Every strike, every threat, every act of force was designed to remind those enslaved that there was no space in which they were free. And when one act of resistance broke through that control, the entire machine trembled until fear was restored. As Thistlewood's authority grew, he moved from student to master. The diary that once observed began to command. He wrote with the confidence of a man who believed himself ordained by the very empire that sent him. He saw the plantation as a microcosm of British order, strict, profitable, and unquestioned. But beneath that structure was something else, something corrosive. The constant need to display power began to erode any boundary between discipline and obsession. Those under his watch lived within the tight perimeter of the estate, surrounded by cane fields that stretched like oceans. Days blurred into weeks, seasons were measured by harvests. Work began before sunrise and often ended after dusk. Nights were short, rest was brief, and punishment was the ever-present shadow at the edge of every task. Yet within that oppression, life still persisted: whispers, songs, small acts of defiance. There were gardens behind the slave quarters where people grew herbs, melons, and yams to supplement their rations, keeping fragments of the world they had lost. There were rituals and stories, spoken softly after dark, that remembered other names, other homelands. Thistlewood rarely acknowledged these moments of humanity. When he did, it was through a detached observation, as though recording the habits of another species. He noted the sounds of drums on distant estates, the rumors of maroon settlements in the mountains, and the coded songs that spread across the fields like wind. He never grasped that the very system he enforced had created a parallel world of endurance and memory beneath it, a hidden network of survival that his diaries could never truly capture. The 1750s brought growth. Thistlewood was promoted to larger estates, managing hundreds of enslaved men and women. His records became more detailed, his language more clipped. Where earlier entries described weather and work, now they cataloged the machinery of plantation management. He became known for his precision, his ability to extract maximum labor, his loyalty to owners who seldom saw the land they profited from. In England, his reports read like evidence of competence. In Jamaica, they were the record of fear turned into productivity. The diary shows moments of contradiction, traces of a man conscious of his own transformation. There are brief reflections on the tropical beauty around him, The mountains, the heavy scent of flowers, the violent storms that rolled across the island and stripped the cane bare. In those passages he seems almost humbled by nature. Yet always he returns to control, to the balance sheets, to the calculations that sustained his position. The plantation system rewarded that focus. It punished any sign of empathy. As the years passed, rebellion became a whisper that never fully ceased. The memory of uprisings elsewhere haunted every plantation. Overseers spoke of loyalty and fear in the same breath. The enslaved found ways to resist, working slowly, feigning illness, damaging tools, running away to join maroon communities in the hills. Each act, however small, carried the weight of defiance. For Thistlewood, every escape was both a professional failure and a personal challenge. His diary recorded them meticulously, noting who fled, who was caught, who never returned. These entries reveal the tension that defined plantation life, the overseer's need for absolute order and the enslaved people's determination, however constrained, to claim moments of freedom. Over time, Thistlewood began to believe that the island itself had a will, that the heat, the insects, the storms were part of its defiance. He wrote of nights filled with the sound of thunder and drums, the feeling that the very air was alive with unrest. The more he tried to impose discipline, the more the land reminded him that nothing was permanent. Crops failed, hurricanes came, disease swept through the quarters and the great houses alike. The empire that seemed so strong in London felt fragile under the weight of the tropics. And yet, through every disaster, the machine rebuilt itself. Ships arrived from England with supplies and replacements, and ships left with barrels of sugar and rum. The trade never paused. Thistlewood continued his work, ever more absorbed in the daily minutiae of control. His diary became the voice of a system that could not see itself, a record that never asked why, only how. What the diary does not say, but what history tells us, is that those who lived under this rule carried the knowledge of their own worth even when the world refused to see it. The Maroons held the mountains, free villages hidden in the forests where they lived on their own terms. Enslaved preachers carried messages of liberation in secret. Songs from West Africa merged with Christian hymns, turning faith into a language of resistance. The plantation sought to erase identity, but identity adapted and survived. For Thistlewood, these undercurrents were irritants, things to be managed. For the people in bondage, they were lifelines. In the distance of his diary entries, we hear two worlds, one of calculation and control, the other of endurance and quiet rebellion. They existed side by side, the overseer and the enslaved, both trapped by the system but not equally bound. The deeper Thistlewood sank into his role, the less he seemed aware of his own moral collapse. He saw himself as efficient, pragmatic, perhaps even just. He wrote of his routines as though they were acts of governance, of civilization brought to a wild land. But behind those words was an empire that justified itself through illusions, that it was bringing order, that it was spreading faith, that it was improving the world. The truth was simpler and darker, it was feeding greed. Toward the end of the decade, the tone of the diary begins to shift again. The confident overseer grows older, his body failing under the same sun that has broken so many others. He speaks of illness, of fever, of sleepless nights. He mentions dreams that disturb him, brief flashes of conscience he never names outright. There are moments when he seems to sense the enormity of what he has witnessed, but he buries it under the routine of another day. He continues to write. He always writes. By now, the diary has become more than a record. It is an extension of the plantation itself, repetitive, merciless, indifferent. Each entry builds upon the last until the years blur together, a testament to the endurance of cruelty disguised as order. Thistlewood's Jamaica remains unchanged on the surface, but beneath it, the foundations of slavery are already beginning to tremble. The voices of the enslaved grow stronger, the Maroon Wars flare again in the mountains, and rumors of abolitionist movements reach the island through sailors and traders. The world that allowed Thomas Thistlewood to thrive is beginning to fracture, though he cannot yet see it. What he knows is the routine, the inspections, the ledgers, the endless cycle of work and punishment, the sense of authority that defines him. What he does not know is that history will remember him not as a man of order, but as a man whose own words became evidence of the system's inhumanity. In the years to come, others will read his diary and see the truth he could not. They will see how empire made monsters of ordinary men, how the pursuit of profit eroded every moral boundary, and how even the smallest act of defiance by the enslaved was an act of courage against an empire of fear. As the 1760s dawn, Thistlewood stands at the height of his power, master of an estate, keeper of records, servant of the British crown. Yet behind the appearance of control, something is beginning to crack. The world he believes eternal is starting to shift beneath him. The overseer has conquered the plantation but not his conscience. The paradise he was promised has long since turned to ash. And soon the diary will record not just domination but decline. The years passed and the island changed its face. The bright ferocity of Thistlewood's youth dulled into the heavy sameness of middle age, the cane fields no longer new, the machinery of slavery no longer astonishing but simply there, an endless repetition of the same cruel logic. The air itself seemed slower now, thick with sugar dust and the smell of boiling molasses. He had lived long enough for habit to replace thought. He rose each morning at the same hour, recorded the weather, the yield, the illness of a worker, the number of casks sent down to the port. His handwriting became smaller, tighter, as though conserving space or breath. The pages of his diary filled one after another, years, then decades. The young man who had once looked upon the tropics with wonder was now a fixture of them, another worn piece of the estate, sun-bleached and unyielding. Phoebe had been there through it all. The records call her his companion, his housekeeper, sometimes even his partner, though in truth she was bound to him by the same system that bound everyone else. Yet within that confinement, something human persisted. She ruled the household with quiet authority, managed the servants, oversaw the cooking, and nursed Thistlewood through bouts of fever that nearly killed him. He depended on her in ways he could never have admitted publicly. She was his translator, his connection to the island's undercurrent of Creole life, its gossip, its rhythms, its food. As his hair grayed and his body weakened, Phoebe became indispensable. Visitors noted her presence, the way she commanded respect within the household. Some even wrote of her with a kind of grudging admiration, though always filtered through the prejudices of their time. To them, it was unthinkable that affection or loyalty could exist between a master and someone enslaved, yet their relationship was precisely that contradiction. Both a distortion of power and, within that distortion, a trace of mutual need. Thistlewood himself recorded her often, her kindness when he was sick, her anger when he strayed, her wit at dinner. His diary does not romanticize her, it cannot. It is the voice of a man incapable of reflection, writing his life as if accounting for his own existence. Yet through the silence between his lines, we see Phoebe as something more, the conscience he never claimed, the witness to everything he became. The Jamaica around them was also aging. The sugar boom that had built fortunes for London investors was faltering. Soil was exhausted, fields overworked, and storms tore through the island with growing ferocity. Hurricanes swept away entire estates, floods drowned the cane. Disease lingered in every swamp and riverbank. Death was constant, not dramatic, not new, just ever-present. For the first time, Thistlewood began to note unease among the planters. Prices fluctuated, profits shrank. Britain itself was changing. There were whispers of reform, of debate in Parliament about the morality of the trade. Books circulated, the writings of men like Granville Sharp and later Wilberforce, challenging what had once been unquestionable. To Thistlewood, these were distant noises irrelevant to his daily world. Yet they reached Jamaica nonetheless, carried by sailors, merchants, and preachers who spoke of conscience and empire in the same breath. He dismissed such talk. For him, the system was the island. To imagine it ending was to imagine the world collapsing. And in a sense he was right. For those who had built their lives upon it, freedom would mean loss, of wealth, of status, of identity. The overseer who had once been poor and forgotten in England had found power here. To let it go would be to face his own insignificance. But change did not wait for permission. Across the island, resistance stirred again. In the mountains, maroon communities grew stronger, trading secretly with the enslaved on nearby plantations. Messages passed at night, warnings, promises, plans. The drums Thistlewood had once dismissed as background noise now sounded like an echo of something larger, a heartbeat under the soil. He could not name the fear that crept into his later entries. It was not rebellion itself, he had faced that before, but the sense that the island no longer obeyed him. The seasons misbehaved, the workers seemed distant, even nature felt altered. The land he once commanded now seemed to regard him with indifference. Hurricanes, earthquakes, fever, each one reminded him that control was an illusion. Phoebe watched all of this in silence. She had lived long enough to see the balance of things begin to tilt. The free black population was growing, tradesmen, tailors, and merchants who bought their freedom and that of their children. In towns, churches opened to them and their children learned to read. It was a slow, uneven progress, but it was happening. Phoebe saw it with the calm patience of someone who understood that history moved in generations, not days. To Thistlewood, however, the world was narrowing. His diary, once a tool of order, became a refuge. He recorded smaller things: the weather, his ailments, his meals, the decline of his estate. There are fewer observations about others, more about himself. The aches, the failing sight, the insomnia. He complained of the damp, of the insects, of dreams that troubled him. The tone had shifted. The overseer's certainty was gone, replaced by a kind of tired resignation. He was a man who had built his life upon control and found, in the end, that control was only temporary. The empire itself was beginning to question its soul, and the colony that had sustained him was becoming restless. He could not see it clearly, but he could feel it. The island's air had changed, heavier, charged with anticipation. Even the birds seemed quieter at dawn. Sometimes he would walk the boundaries of the estate, leaning on his cane, staring out at the fields he once ruled with absolute authority. He saw new growth where storms had flattened the old, weeds reclaiming what had been cleared. Nature was patient. It waited for no man. In those walks, he passed the quarters, where voices murmured in languages he never learned. Children played outside, their laughter carrying across the field like a sound from another world. It was a world he had never truly entered, one of memory, endurance, and hope. He could not see that it was stronger than the world he had built, that it would outlast him. Phoebe aged too, her body slowing, her health faltering. Yet even as she weakened, she remained the center of that household, the one who kept its fragile order. She had seen masters come and go, overseers rise and fall. She had outlived storms, sickness, and sorrow. Her quiet endurance was the kind that history often forgets but which carries civilizations through their darkest hours. Thistlewood did not write her eulogy when her time came. The diary notes her illness, the treatment, the weather, and then moves on to the next day as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But the silences in those pages speak louder than any entry. After her death, the handwriting changes again, looser, uncertain, the script of a man whose anchor has slipped away. He lived for several more years, though less a master than a ghost within his own creation. The estate continued its routine, but he was no longer the center of it. Younger overseers came with new methods, new ambitions. He recorded their presence politely, distantly, as one might record the passing of clouds. His world was fading even as he kept writing it into being. In London, the debate over slavery had reached Parliament. Petitions circulated, public opinion shifted. The sugar that once symbolized refinement now carried the taste of guilt. British households were beginning to ask where it came from, whose hands had produced it. The empire's conscience, long dormant, was stirring, slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably. Thistlewood would not live to see abolition. He would not witness the uprisings that followed, nor the final collapse of the system he had served. But his diaries would survive him, thousands of pages documenting every detail of a life built upon the suffering of others. He believed he was writing for posterity, a man of order preserving the record of his management. He could not know that posterity would judge him by that record and see not order but complicity. As the century turned, the world he represented began to crumble. Hurricanes continued to tear through Jamaica, but now their destruction felt symbolic, as though the island itself was cleansing what had been built upon it. The great houses decayed, their paint peeled, their gardens overgrown. What had once been a monument to empire was now a ruin in slow motion. Thistlewood's final entries are thin, weary, stripped of pretense. He writes of weakness, of failing memory, of pain. The overseer who once commanded hundreds now struggles to command his own body. There is no revelation, no remorse recorded, only the steady fading of a man who cannot imagine the world without himself. And yet, beyond those pages, the world continues. The enslaved people he once ruled endure. Their descendants carry forward the songs, the stories, the fragments of identity that survived every attempt to erase them. The empire that justified itself through civilization learns, too late, that it cannot wash away the stains of its own making. And in that contrast, between the silence of the overseer's last words and the rising voices of the free, lies the truth of the island's history. Thistlewood dies quietly, his diary sealed away, unread for generations. But the island remembers. The soil he once measured in profit becomes the ground of remembrance, of testimony, of reckoning. His pen recorded the facts. History reveals their meaning. The overseer who sought to control every life around him becomes, in the end, evidence of a world that controlled him as well. The overseer was gone, but his words remained. Bound in leather, darkened by age, the diary waited in silence, passing from one hand to another, forgotten in an archive, buried beneath the dust of centuries. For generations it slept, while the island itself healed in fragments. The cane fields grew back, the estates changed owners, the great houses crumbled into ruin. Only the land remembered. It always remembers. Jamaica moved forward through storms of its own: rebellion, emancipation, poverty, pride. The empire that had once claimed to civilize was now learning to explain itself, to defend its own history. In London, marble statues gleamed under clean skies, while in the Caribbean, the soil was still rich with stories the empire refused to tell. Yet history, like the sea, does not lose what it carries. It returns, wave after wave, reshaping the shore until the truth can no longer be hidden. When the diary was finally opened again, centuries later, scholars read in disbelief. Page after page of ordinary cruelty, written in a calm clerk's hand. It was not a confession, it was a mirror. The overseer had documented everything, believing he was preserving order, unaware that he was recording a crime too vast for repentance. The words were simple, unadorned: weather, labor, names, yet behind each entry was a human life, marked and erased by ink. Historians call it evidence. Descendants call it memory. The diary became a window into a world too easily forgotten, a world where suffering had been routine and silence had been policy. It forced the empire to face itself, not through grand speeches or noble letters, but through the daily handwriting of a man who never questioned what he was part of. And as readers turned those pages, the question that lingered was not about him, but about us. What do we remember? What do we choose to forget? On the island, traces of that past remain everywhere, in the rhythm of language, in the music that grew from pain and hope alike, in the ruins overgrown by vines where walls once echoed with commands. The descendants of the enslaved built new lives upon that ground. They turned sorrow into song, memory into strength. Every note of reggae, every proverb, every celebration of survival carries within it a defiance older than freedom itself. The overseer's house no longer stands. The wind moves through the place where it once did, carrying the scent of the sea and the voices of a new people who refuse to vanish. Children play in the grass where his footsteps once fell. They do not know his name. They do not need to. The island has chosen what to remember. Some say history is written by the victors. But here it is rewritten by those who endured. Their stories fill the silence his diary left behind, the unrecorded laughter, the prayers whispered in the dark, the quiet triumph of survival. What the overseer tried to erase, they carried forward in their blood. In every plantation ruin, every overgrown path, the past still speaks. Not as a ghost to be feared, but as a teacher. It whispers of what power can do when it forgets mercy, and of what the human spirit can do when it remembers itself. The diary ends, but its echoes do not. They live in archives and classrooms, in songs sung at night, in the memory of a people who will not let the world forget. The overseer is long gone, but his record endures, not as he intended, but as the testimony of those he could never silence. And so, the story closes where it began, on an island of light and shadow, where cruelty once called itself order, and endurance turned itself into freedom. The overseer's pen is still, the pages complete, the ink faded, but history once hidden has learned to speak again. This has been Hidden Tales, where the past still speaks. Subscribe for more stories history tried to forget.